Good evening, everybody. We're just waiting for everyone to join us for the Q&A for the premiere of the featured documentary Entangled by David Abel, who is joining us tonight for the Q&A. My name is Judy Laster. I'm the director of the Woods Hole Film Festival, and this is our 29th year, but our first year as the virtual film festival. It's been an interesting year, to say the least. In the middle of March, we had no plans to be a virtual event. However, as with everyone else, given the global pandemic, we were left with no choice. And so for the last 2 months, we worked pretty much around the clock to make this happen. We are thrilled that we have so many great films at the festival this year. We have 187 films, 42 features. The rest are shorts, and we have Q&As, we have workshops, panel discussions, music, and lots more. If you are a ticket holder, one of the things to remember is that you are also the judge. We give audience and jury awards at the Woods Hole Film Festival. So when you watch a film in the platform, next to the beginning, next to the initial picture of the film, there's a star system. So just go back. You can go back anytime until August 1st and rate the films. These awards definitely matter for filmmakers. This festival could not happen without the support of many people. Our sponsors who are presented to you prior to every screening, our grant funders, and the filmmakers, of course, who make these amazing films. But we also have staff working pretty much around the clock from many different places to bring you the virtual Woods Hole Film Festival. So I hope that you will take the week to really explore the amazing breadth of films that we have. Lots of issues are presented. I'm sure we'll have some incredible discussions. For the Q&As, which are live events, we will later be posting them on YouTube. So if you like what you've seen and you think somebody else might want to see it, later on when we post them on YouTube, they can go check it out. The other thing is that for this particular Q&A, this is a webinar, so that means that David and I are chatting live, we're on screen. You as the audience are welcome to participate through the Q&A function on the bar across the bottom. You can type in questions. And after he and I speak for a while, we will then take your questions. I will read them to him, and we will answer them for you. So please enjoy. Thank you for being here this evening. And so David, welcome. This is not your first film at the Woods Hole Film Festival, but this is the first screening, I believe, of this film. Am I correct about that?
Yes, this is the world premiere.
So tell us.
A strange world premiere.
Strange world premiere. We're in the strange world. So we are actually live in Woods Hole as we speak. Woods Hole being a place that has a lot of relevance to your film, because many of the people in the scientific community who work on issues around right whales and entanglement in general, oceanography, are located either in Woods Hole at the scientific institutions or on Cape Cod at other organizations. And so when you decided to make this film, I know, well, we should set this up. So you are, by day, a reporter at the Boston Globe, and you write about many of these issues in your day job. Is that correct?
That's true, yep.
That is true. You're not on the stand here. I won't try and sound like a lawyer. Yeah. So when you decide how you're gonna, what kind of films you're going to make, and your prior film, Lobster Wars, was also about similar kinds of issues, how much impact does the work that you do as a reporter have on your decision about what type of films to make?
Great. Well, let me just first off say thank you so much for sharing our film with your audience. We are thrilled to be able to show a second film at the Woods Hole Film Festival, and we know we submitted this probably late. We just finished the film in May, and you were very gracious, Judy, to consider it after the time period elapsed, and so we're really fortunate and wanted to show the film at this festival because, as you mentioned, it is there are so many people working on these issues in Woods Hole and not far away throughout Cape Cod, and we also wanted to get the film out as soon as possible this summer because these issues are live, and all of the concerns that are addressed in the film are things that have been unresolved and will continue to play out over the coming weeks and months and probably years, for the good and the bad. But to answer your question, we I would say that my principal focus is being a reporter for the paper, and I moonlight as a filmmaker. And the stories that I choose to make films about are stories that really are the outgrowth of my reporting for the paper, and those are stories that I feel like need a broader, different context that would merit the treatment of a film. And certainly Lobster War, my last film, was an outgrowth of a story I wrote for the paper, and it was about how climate change is affecting lobster in many ways through the prism of this conflict over this place called the Gray Zone between Nova Scotia and down East Maine. And I felt after making that story, after writing that story for the paper, that there was just a deeper, broader narrative that would be told in a really potentially moving way on film. And so that's why I decided to devote a year to making the last film, Lobster War. And this film, Entangled, is an outgrowth of much of that reporting and much of that time I spent making Lobster War. There are lots of similar issues. This film is about climate change in many ways, and lots of the issues that we learned about making that film led us to this subject and to this film.
So, one of the things at the Woods Hole Film Festival, being where we are, we try when possible to show films about the science that people are working on in this community. And in fact, we have a film and science initiative that is part of the Woods Hole Film Festival. And that the goal of that initiative is to bring together filmmakers and scientists to communicate with each other, but also to make better films about science, because we know that the issues people are working on are so immediate and people need to know about them. With regard to the subject of this particular film, I personally feel like, not that we've seen this a lot, but this story is continuous. It never really gets fixed. Maybe that's because it's an unfixable problem, but maybe it's also because there's so many competing interests that there are always going to be winners and losers. And so when you make a film about a subject like this, how hard is it to know when you're done? And we actually already have a question in the Q&A by one of the world's leading experts. So, but we'll talk about this and then we'll take the question. But how do you know when you're done? Because this issue happens over a continuum.
It's a great question, and the answer is that we might not actually be done. It's possible that we will decide to update the film depending on what the ultimate broadcast of the film is. But we certainly changed the ending of this film a few times as we were nearing our final cut, in part because so many things were changing, and there were these federal lawsuits that had decisions or rulings that just came out just as we were finishing the film, and so we made some small changes to account for those. And the truth is that when we were making the film, we sort of thought the potential ending of the film was what now is sort of the midpoint of the film, and that was this moment when this body called the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team, which is composed of government officials from NOAA and from states and fishermen and conservationists and others, came to what many people considered to be a historic decision. There was a near unanimous vote to take what was believed to be the first real significant action that might make a difference to reduce entanglements. And that was this vote that all but one of those members took that that suggested that there would be a cut by as much as half in the number of lobster lines in the Gulf of Maine, or much of the Gulf of Maine. And of course, as you see in the film, there was, after a lot of the fishermen agreed to that, there was a backlash, and then a lot of the fishermen, particularly from Maine, who began opposing that agreement, had basically fought it and proposed alternatives, and that delayed this regulatory process. And NOAA was supposed to issue these regulations that would have incorporated that historic vote. I think last year they were supposed to initially issue these rules, and then that got delayed until early this year, then March, then July, and now they're saying maybe September. But given the great emotions sparked by these issues, it doesn't seem, to me at least, that that's terribly likely to happen, given that we're in election season, and these are very political issues. And President Trump was just in Maine, where he heard from a lot of lobstermen who basically oppose these measures very strongly. And so action might not take place until a new administration takes office, or until next year, if the current administration remains in office.
And I just, for our audience, not everyone may have seen the film yet. And so, but I would imagine everyone who is in the audience is interested in these issues and perhaps has areas of expertise that they can also contribute to the conversation, again, through the chat. And one person who really has an amazing amount of expertise, and who the Boston Globe did an incredible piece about maybe 5 or 6 years ago, is Michael Moore. And he said, your film was a balanced presentation. Thank you. Given your deep immersion in the topic of the right whale crisis, as you made the film, what do you think we are all failing to do to enable the survival and growth of the species while ensuring the fishing and shipping industries prosper? And that's really the issue. We want everyone to survive. I don't think anybody's saying somebody has to go away. People are saying techniques have to go away and harm has to go away. But so I guess Dr. Moore is looking to you as the storyteller in this instance to sort of give us a way to think about this.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, as probably many people who are listening to this know, Michael Moore is absolutely amazing, and I am deeply grateful to him and to many other people who are participating right now for their time, their expertise, for putting up with my often insipid, simple-minded questions, perhaps, and I certainly couldn't suggest that I have an answer that Michael hasn't given a lot of thought to already. It seems like there are a whole host of options, all of which most of the players know quite well. Ultimately, it seems to me that there is a potential way of squaring the circle, and that might be difficult still, but I could see a world where both the fishing industry and the conservation efforts to protect right whales could live in harmony if, as we discussed in the film, there is a more concerted effort to bring about a new type of fishing, which is called ropeless fishing. And and while today the technology is still in a formative state, it's conceivable to me, and I think to Michael and to many other people, that if there were sufficient federal subsidies or help that we provide for the similar to the kinds of things that we provide for the agricultural industry and many other industries, we could help the fishing industry, which is vital. The lobster industry is North America's most valuable fishery. It's a distinct part of the economy of our region, and especially Maine. And I don't think anyone wants to see these guys and women lose their livelihoods. And some of them, and we meet one couple, Rob and Lori, who straddle the interests of protecting and helping the whales. Can you guys still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. They show that it doesn't have to be black or white, that there doesn't have to be an either or situation here, that there could be, that there are good people on both sides that could work toward a solution. And certainly Rob Martin, who we feature in the film, has spent a lot of time, probably more than any other fisherman, I would venture, working with a lot of the scientists and startup folks and businessmen and engineers who are trying to make this technology work. So, so ultimately, as we discussed toward the end of the film, there is a reasonable way of going about this. And of course, there is an alternative solution that we are seeing play out right now, which is legal pressure that is being brought to bear by a number of conservation groups on NOAA fisheries to press them to act. And within the coming weeks and months, these rulings will yield to legal remedies or action required on the part of the agency and perhaps fishermen that could prompt some of the things that I've mentioned to happen more quickly.
So, I mean, one perspective in this that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation is that of the general public. Like, why should people care? I mean, we hear about extinction of right whales, we hear about entanglement, but most people in their lives are not going to see a right whale. They are not going to be having the experience of making that incredible being a personal part of their lives. What do you think can be done to sort of elevate the conversation above policy considerations and rulemaking and sort of the inner workings of government, to elevate this to making people care and say, we have to make sure that the right whales survive, because every strike, every ship strike, every entanglement is one fewer whale on the planet. And so in making the film, did you come away with any sort of feeling of a broader conversation that people can have?
Well, I think that in some ways is part of what we've tried to do with this film, and that is raise awareness about what's happening, the challenges, and what's at stake. When President Trump went to Maine a couple of weeks back, he called, when he was asked about this issue, he clearly didn't know anything about it and referred to right whales as white whales, which got a good laugh from a lot of people. and it just suggested that that there are many people around the country who have no idea that there is this incredibly endangered species, the most endangered large mammal, I believe, on the planet. And my hope is that as more people understand the nuance and the complexity of these issues and the role that climate change is playing in this and in so many other issues, leading potentially to the extinction of some 1 million species by the end of the century, which is something that's such a difficult thing to fathom, something that is such a large number that it's beguiling, that hopefully folks who see this film will understand that there are ways and there are things that could be done to protect right whales. And if enough pressure is brought to bear on officials to actually enact many of the proposed regulations, while also looking after the vital lobster industry, there are ways to square the proverbial circle, I think.
So we have another question, I believe, from John Bullard. David, I think you told a very important story very well. Why do you think Maine agreed to the TRT plan and then backed out? Were they out of touch with their constituents?
You know, that's a great question. And I actually put that question, and you hear it in the film. I don't think you hear my question. But when the commissioner of the Department of Marine Resources in Maine was talking late last year, I believe, or earlier this year, I've lost track of any sense of time, about the potential regulations and the concerns for the fishing industry. I asked him what made him change, and he basically gave an answer that wasn't, to me at least, fully didn't seem to get didn't fully answer my question. And he seemed to suggest that they were rushed by the process, and that they felt like they were on the spot, and it was only after they had time to consider the potential implications of the proposed regulations that they actually decided to back away from them. I didn't find that a terribly satisfying answer, because I think the people at the Department of Marine Resources in Maine are really smart. They understand the implications very well. And I think that, you know, I'm not going to guess. John Bullard, of course, is the former regional administrator of NOAA, so I would love to hear his thoughts on this matter. He probably has a far more informed and smarter answer than I could give.
We have a question from Jack Clark, I believe formerly of Mass Audubon, if I'm not mistaken. Can you imagine a situation where conservation organizations would share the cost of implementing a tech change like ropeless trapping with the lobster industry? And that is sort of what I was going to ask too. Can technology and science really drive the policy response here? Because it seems like this conversation has been happening for years and years and years, and getting places very slowly.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and you know, a lot of the conservation groups raise a lot of money for their advocacy, and I don't know if they would be eager to part with their money for funding these changes, and I also don't think they necessarily have sufficient money to do that. I think their goal is to raise enough money so that they can raise awareness and also pressure the federal government and maybe state governments to to use their financial wherewithal to enact some of the measures that we've discussed. So, but I think it's a good question from Jack about whether the conservation groups would be willing to put their money where their mouth is in some ways, and maybe instead of just advocating and filing lawsuits, maybe working more directly with fishermen to try to ease the transition. That all said, I think that simplifies the complexities of this, and I think even if there was the money to make this transition, I think there's a great deal of skepticism among a lot of lobstermen that this is actually the right solution, that it could work, that it wouldn't make their lives more difficult and ultimately more expensive. And of course, there's a lot of truth to those concerns, because this kind of technology has never been used at the scale that I think a lot of folks have envisioned if it were to really come into practice. But of course, it could be, and hopefully will be, used in smaller areas. Some of the proposed regulations that I've heard are the likely outcome of the TRT process that I was discussing a few minutes ago, and that NOAA is apparently hoping to implement, would involve potentially some additional closed areas to fishing, but those closures would, as far as I understand, allow for ropeless fishing. And so if it's true that necessity is the mother of invention, and folks who want to continue fishing in those areas might be pressed to try these new technologies of ropeless fishing out in a more extensive way, and maybe that could help prove the concept to see whether it really could work.
For some people who may be joining us who don't know as extensively the sort of details of this issue, how many right whales currently exist? How many would we want to have ideally to delist the right whale from being on the endangered species list? And is that really possible at this point in time?
Yeah, I don't think anyone envisions a time when they're going to be removed from the endangered species list. In fact, international conservation group just a few weeks ago ratcheted up the listing from endangered to critically endangered. So the idea of the opposite happening anytime soon doesn't seem really realistic. But right now, the best estimates I've heard are there probably in the vicinity of about 395 or so right whales left, with something close to 85 reproductive females. And that, of course, is the most important number, because without sufficient reproductive females, we are not going to rebuild the species. This past year, this past calving season, there were 10 right whale calves born, which was far better than what it was in the previous 2 years. In 2018, there were 0 calves born, which was unprecedented, and a big shot across the bow of everyone who cares about this species and who has been trying to find a way to improve the health of this species. In 2019, I believe there were 7 right whales that were born. But there, as we note at the end of the film, there are really, in order to keep the species viable, there need to be in the order of 30 calves that are born every year. And such a large number hasn't happened in many years. and there are all kinds of explanations for why that has been. And among those explanations, apparently, is increasing entanglements. And those entanglements not only kill right whales, but they tend to have a long-term impact on many of them, especially the females, in that when they're swimming with this heavy gear, it tends to require a huge amount of effort or a greater amount of body fat, which they can't end up using to store the nutrients that they need to ultimately give birth or to make the passage down to the southeastern coast of the country, where they traditionally have given birth.
For anybody who may not have ever seen the piece that the Boston Globe did with Michael Moore, it's really worth finding it to see it. It was just fantastic. And
Chasing Bela.
Yeah, and just really worth seeing. I mean, I think it makes you understand the personal side and the personal connection that we have and need to have to this issue. But so we have another question. Tim Whitehouse, how much has the lobster industry grown in the past 50 years? Are lobsters overharvested? How much is exported?
Well, that's a good question. So the lobster catch, at least in Maine, has surged in recent years, and that has also been a function of climate change, arguably in a number of ways. And that was actually the subject of my last film, Lobster War. So as the record catch in Maine was in 2016, despite actually a tweet by President Trump just after leaving Maine a few weeks ago, in which he suggested that the lobster industry has never been so good now, was really undergoing terrible situation during the Obama administration. But the truth is that during the Obama administration, or in the last year of his administration, 2016, which of course had nothing to do with Barack Obama, there was something in the order of 130 million pounds caught, with a record value of more than of something in the nature of a $500 million. And that has been a huge source of income for Maine, and the numbers and the catch and the value of that catch has increased substantially since over the past 50 years. I can't quote you off the top of my head how much that increase has been, but it's, I think, tripled or quadrupled since just 2000.
So sort of coming back to that, this is not just a domestic problem. And, everything that happens is interconnected. And so even if we are trying to solve this right here, right now, how do we think about it in the context of the greater global marketplace and what that means to the desire to really come up with a solution to the issue of possible extinction of right whales? Is there something that we can do, again, in terms of how we think of our place in the global fishing industry that can be sort of adopted to this problem or attached to it, so that we make people care even more? And I don't know if I'm clear with this question, but I'm trying.
Well, I'm going to answer it. I'm not sure exactly if I'm going to answer it the way you asked it, but I have heard a good amount of talk about the concept of whale-safe lobster, and there are certifications for other fisheries that about whether they're sustainable or not, and there has been efforts to try to label certain fishing practices as anti whale, if that's the right expression, and perhaps that movement might raise people's attention. I was just with a friend today who was telling me she's given up chocolate, and she, which to me is apostate, but especially during a pandemic. However, she had learned a lot about how where cocoa beans come from and the products that make chocolate, and was appalled, and made a decision that she's going to give up chocolate. And I think it's conceivable, if there was sufficient pressure and attention. Sorry about that. I don't know if you could hear that. I'm on the porch in my my place in Jamaica Plain. There are motorcycles racing by. There, that could potentially have bring pressure to bear against fishermen, and I haven't seen people's desire for lobster change yet, but with sufficient public pressure, that certainly could change the scenario to some extent.
So we have time for a few more questions. Audience, if you want to type them into the Q&A or the chat. But so again, let's come back to this as a film and your role as a filmmaker. When you're putting a story together like this story, which has so much to it and it's so complicated and has so many constituencies, how do you decide which part of the story you're going to tell?
Well, I come at my work as a journalist, and my hope is to try to tell the story as fairly, as thoughtfully, as nuanced, and of course, as in a compelling way as possible as I can. And I look for some kind of narrative structure that will provide a narrative, and in this film, it's the for lack of a better word, the regulatory process and the effort to try to find common ground among a range of folks who have deeply vested interests in this subject. And so I really am just trying to probe a story, and tell it with as much detail and in a way that hopefully will make people pay attention and want to understand the issues, as opposed to necessarily just point fingers. I like to say that my goal with the last 3 of these fishing films that I've now made a trilogy of fishing films. The first was Sacred Cod, which was about the collapse of the cod fishery and the impact of overfishing and climate change. And the other was Lobster War. My hope is ultimately, these are all stories about how our climate is changing and how they've impacted people's lives. And my ultimate hope is that the takeaway in some ways is that climate change is not some distant abstract threat, but one that is really having an impact on our lives here and now. And I think we're seeing that with the changes in the migration and feeding patterns of right whales. We're seeing it with the changing distribution of lobster. We're seeing it with the inability of the cod species, which was what brought settlers from Europe to the United States. It's what the Pilgrims sought to make a living from and survive on. The warming waters have made it very difficult for the cod species to bounce back. And this story, where I actually really came at it from, was last year. I read this study by the United Nations that suggested that we are at risk of losing 1 million species by the end of the century. And as I mentioned, how unfathomable that number is, I was thinking, how do you tell that story? How do you tell a story about this incredibly large number that's incomprehensible, that's meaningless to so many people? And my idea was to try to tell it through one species, a particularly iconic species, and one that's really close to the to that threshold where it won't be able to rebuild the population.
So that means you'll probably have another film, because there are lots of other stories that need to be told, and probably continuously. We'll call you the fishing film guy. And
yeah, I don't know how I got here, because I actually I grew up with like basically an allergy to fish and seafood, and somehow
perfect. You're not part of the problem.
Yes, well, somehow I got drawn to these stories. Someone was trying to persuade me to do another film or book, potentially even about sharks. So we'll see. But I don't know.
One last question from the audience. So great film, Eric Madsen says. What happens in Entangled Part 2?
Well, the hope is that that we'll learn ultimately what the federal government, whether the federal government actually takes action. They've been talking about action for quite some time, and there hasn't really been any effective change, as you've noted several times, to this ongoing debate. So hopefully we'll have some resolution on that in the not distant future. And we'll also begin to see real action on things like ropeless fishing that might, or other techniques like using different kind of rope and requiring different kind of rope that breaks with less pressure. Some of that's already happening, but if that's more widely adopted, that could potentially also mean fewer entanglements. But there's a whole other problem that we really haven't addressed, which we touch on in the film a little bit, of course, is the issue of ship strikes. And I mentioned that there were 10 calves that were born this calving season. Well, sadly, 2 of those calves have already been found dead, and both of them were were apparently as a result of some kind of vessel striking them. So, so entanglement in fishing gear is not the only concern facing this species.
Well, I want to thank you for being with us tonight and for bringing the film to the Woods Hole Film Festival. For the people who joined us, if you haven't seen the film, it is available for you to see through midnight or 11:59 on August 1st. And as I mentioned, this is, as all films are, eligible for an audience award. So please don't forget to vote. Vote early and often, but only one vote counts at the very end. And I would just like to thank the sponsors of this screening, Nobska Farms and WBUR in Boston. And I hope that everybody enjoys the festival. And David, I look forward to having Entangled Part 2 here in the next couple of years. So,
okay.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you so much. Okay. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining.
Bye-bye.